Sirens are sounding across Bahrain and Kuwait right now. Missiles and drones are in the air. This is happening in the hours right after the United States carried out its largest single wave of strikes against Iran since this ceasefire began, and Iran has now confirmed it launched a retaliatory operation against American positions in the Gulf, describing it as only the initial response. The President of the United States has already declared the ceasefire and the underlying memorandum with Iran effectively over. We are watching, in real time, the collapse of the fragile framework that has held this conflict in check for the past 3 weeks. Every detail that follows is drawn from confirmed statements by CENTCOM, Iran's own state media and IRGC statements, on-the-record comments from the president himself, and reporting from wire services and outlets tracking this conflict directly on the ground. Given how quickly this specific situation is still developing, some individual claims, particularly casualty figures, reported by either side, remain genuinely unconfirmed and are presented here with that caveat attached rather than as settled fact. Let's walk through exactly what's confirmed right now, because the pace of developments over the past 24 hours has been extraordinary and every piece of it matters, from the tanker attacks that triggered this cycle through to the diplomatic fallout still unfolding at this exact moment. Start with what triggered this specific round of escalation. Iranian forces struck 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz on Monday and Tuesday, hitting the Marshall Islands flagged tanker Rekayyat, the Saudi-flagged supertanker Wedyan, and the Liberian-flagged Cyprus Prosperity. The American response came overnight into Wednesday, with the United States Central Command announcing it had struck more than 80 separate targets across Iran using precision munitions, hitting air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps small boats operating in and around the strait. Video released by CENTCOM showed direct strikes on Iranian fast attack boats, explosions and flaming wreckage where those vessels had been moored just moments before. That video footage matters beyond its immediate shock value, because it represents genuine, verifiable evidence of the scale of destruction inflicted during this specific operation, rather than relying solely on written statements from either side. Watching direct impact footage of fast attack craft being destroyed in real time, with the resulting wreckage clearly visible in the aftermath, provides a level of independent confirmation that the written casualty and damage claims circulating from both governments throughout this conflict frequently lack. That's precisely why CENTCOM's decision to release this specific footage publicly carries weight beyond simple messaging, offering something closer to direct, visual proof of at least this particular portion of the overnight strike campaign. Iran's retaliation followed within hours, and it arrived at genuine scale. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced it had launched what it called a joint missile and drone operation, striking 85 separate targets across Bahrain and Kuwait, specifically naming Port Salman, the American Fifth Fleet's naval base in Bahrain, and Kuwait's Ali al-Salem air base, as targets it claimed to have destroyed. Iran separately claimed its air defenses shot down an American MQ-9 Reaper drone over Bushehr province during this exchange. Sirens sounded across both Bahrain and Kuwait as this attack unfolded, with residents in both countries urged to move to shelters. Kuwait's own military confirmed it, intercepted 2 hostile ballistic missiles and 13 drones during at least one wave of the attack, with no impacts reported in that specific engagement. Whether earlier or later waves caused any actual impacts inside Kuwait remains unclear as this situation continues developing. It's worth applying the same scrutiny to Iran's claimed 85 targets that is applied throughout this entire conflict to Iranian battlefield claims more broadly. Iran's own military and state media have a consistent, well-documented history of reporting dramatically higher figures for successful strikes against American and Allied positions than independent damage assessments have subsequently confirmed. That doesn't mean this specific retaliatory operation didn't happen. And the sirens across Bahrain and Kuwait, along with Kuwait's own confirmed interceptions, demonstrate the attack was real and substantial. But the specific claim of 85 destroyed installations, including a named naval base and a named air base, should be treated as an Iranian government claim awaiting independent verification, rather than as an already confirmed outcome. Iran's own Revolutionary Guard confirmed a casualty on its own side during this exchange. A member of the Guard's naval forces, identified as Mohammad Reza Kazini, was killed by shrapnel, while, according to the IRGC's own statement, confronting what it described as hostile drones near Mashhar, a port city in Khuzestan province close to the Iraqi border. Iranian state media separately reported a series of explosions in Bushehr province, with Iran's own security officials confirming that 2 military bases, one in Dashti County and another near the town of Chogadak, were struck by what Iranian officials called enemy projectiles early Wednesday morning. Iranian state media has separately claimed a total of 8 IRGC members killed across the strikes on Bandar Abbas and Bushehr combined, though only the death in Mashhar has been specifically confirmed by name through an official IRGC statement. That gap between a single officially named casualty and a broader, claimed total of 8 deaths follows the same pattern of unconfirmed aggregate figures that has characterized Iranian reporting throughout this conflict. Naming a specific individual, providing his unit affiliation, and the exact circumstances of his death represents a considerably higher standard of verification than a broader, unnamed casualty figure attributed to state media without individual confirmation. That distinction matters for anyone trying to assess the actual human toll of this latest exchange with any real precision, rather than simply accepting whichever total happens to circulate most widely in the immediate aftermath. There is a human cost to this exchange that deserves to be stated plainly rather than buried beneath the military statistics, because it illustrates exactly how these strikes ripple beyond their intended military targets. In Sirik, local fishing fleets were caught in the bombardment, with rights groups reporting that Balak fishermen were killed or injured in the strikes on that coastal area. One of the deceased has been identified by local rights organizations as 26-year-old Omid Arabi from the town of Bandar-e-Kohastak. Tehran's government has remained silent regarding civilian casualties from these strikes, acknowledging only the single military death in Mashhar through official channels, even as independent rights monitors report a considerably different picture of civilian harm along that same stretch of coastline. That silence from Tehran regarding civilian casualties deserves its own scrutiny, separate from the question of who bears responsibility for any individual strike. A government that has spent this entire war readily publicizing civilian casualties inflicted by American and Israeli strikes, using those casualties as a central pillar of its own narrative about the injustice of this conflict, choosing instead to stay quiet about civilian fishermen killed along its own coastline during this specific round of strikes, suggests a government more comfortable publicizing civilian harm when it serves a propaganda purpose than when doing so might complicate its own narrative of a purely military, precisely targeted American assault. Now, the president's own words, because they represent as direct a statement as this administration has made about the state of this conflict since it began. Speaking to reporters at the NATO summit in Ankara, the president was asked directly whether the memorandum of understanding with Iran was now over. His answer left no ambiguity. As far as he was concerned, it was over. He described Iran's leadership in blunt terms, calling them scum, describing them as sick and violent people, and stating that if they possessed a nuclear weapon, they would use it. He drew a specific contrast between Iran's leadership and the American officials handling negotiations, naming Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner as people he considered good-faith negotiators, while describing Iran's own negotiators as liars who would agree to terms privately, only to publicly deny having discussed them at all once they left the room. That specific complaint about agreements reached privately being publicly denied afterward is worth taking seriously as a genuine description of a recurring diplomatic problem, rather than dismissing it as simple political rhetoric. Negotiations conducted through indirect channels, as these have been throughout this conflict, depend heavily on both sides maintaining consistent positions between private discussions and public statements. If Iranian negotiators have, in fact, repeatedly reached tentative understandings in private, only to publicly characterize those same discussions differently once they returned home, that pattern would erode exactly the kind of trust any durable negotiated settlement requires, regardless of how sympathetic or unsympathetic either side's broader position might otherwise be. Pressed further on whether this meant talks would not resume once Iran's funeral proceedings for its slain supreme leader concluded, the president's answer was similarly direct. They could talk if they wanted to, he said, but he believed it would be a waste of time. He extended his criticism into a broader indictment of the Iranian government's treatment of its own population, referencing a death toll of 54,000 people from Iran's own domestic protest crackdowns, and stating plainly that the reason no popular uprising had yet succeeded in removing this government was simple. Protesters had no weapons, while the government's forces did, and continued using them. He said the press was not reporting this reality, calling Iran's leadership bad people, while separately noting that some individual leaders he had dealt with throughout this process he considered rational and reasonable, with only a smaller number he specifically did not trust or like. That distinction the president drew between Iran's leadership broadly and a smaller subset he specifically singled out as untrustworthy is worth noting because it complicates the simpler narrative of blanket condemnation his harshest language might otherwise suggest. Rather than treating every Iranian official as equally responsible for the conduct he was criticizing, he appeared to be drawing an implicit distinction between figures within Iran's government he considers capable of rational good faith engagement and a narrower group he views as fundamentally untrustworthy. That kind of distinction, even if not fully elaborated in the moment, suggests the door to renewed engagement with at least some elements of Iran's government may not be as completely closed as his more sweeping condemnations might otherwise imply. Markets reacted immediately and sharply to this combination of resumed strikes and a presidential declaration that the underlying ceasefire framework was now effectively dead. Brent crude jumped 6%, trading near $78 a barrel, while European stock markets fell roughly 1.5%. That kind of immediate, synchronized market reaction across both energy and equity markets reflects genuine, widespread concern among investors that this conflict has now entered a considerably less predictable phase than the uneasy, if fragile, equilibrium that had held for the past several weeks. A 6% single-day jump in the world's primary oil benchmark is not a routine market fluctuation. It's the kind of move that reflects traders genuinely repricing the probability of sustained, serious disruption to the region's oil infrastructure and shipping lanes, rather than treating this latest exchange as simply another temporary flare-up in an already familiar pattern. Combined with a synchronized decline across European equity markets, this specific market reaction suggests investors are treating the president's declaration that the ceasefire is effectively over as qualitatively different from the previous rounds of escalation. This same conflict has already produced a genuine inflection point rather than simply the latest data point in an already familiar cycle. The economic pressure campaign extended beyond the battlefield itself. The Treasury Department formally reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil sales, revoking a waiver that had been granted as part of the original memorandum. A waiver that had permitted Iran to sell crude oil during the ceasefire's negotiating window and had been scheduled to remain in effect until August 21st. The waiver's revocation strips Iran of a significant revenue stream at the exact moment its military capability in the Strait has just absorbed one of the most significant single strikes of the entire war. Iran's foreign ministry responded with a detailed public accounting of exactly which provisions of the memorandum it believes the United States has now violated. Iranian officials specifically cited American interference with Iran's own designated shipping arrangements in the Strait, continued American threats of further strikes, the reinstatement of oil sanctions, direct attacks on southern Iran, and continued Israeli military action in Lebanon, arguing that this combination of factors has rendered the memorandum effectively without content. Iran's parliament speaker and chief negotiator stated publicly that the era of what he called bullying and extortion was over, declaring flatly that Iran does not fold. Iran's top military command separately warned that any entity providing support to what it called American aggressive military action would itself become a legitimate target for Iranian retaliation, a warning clearly aimed at Gulf states hosting American forces. That warning carries real weight given how this exact conflict has unfolded previously. Kuwait and Bahrain, the two countries targeted in this latest round of Iranian retaliation, host American military infrastructure specifically because of their strategic position in the Gulf, not because either government has taken an active combat role in this war themselves. Threatening those countries directly, rather than limiting retaliation purely to American military assets, places civilian populations and infrastructure in nations that have repeatedly stated they do not wish to be drawn deeper into this conflict directly in the line of fire. The Gulf Cooperation Council's own Secretary General condemned Iran's attacks on Bahrain and Kuwait in stark terms, describing them as treacherous and as a continuation of what he characterized as Iran's broader pattern of undermining regional security and peace efforts. That kind of direct, unequivocal condemnation from the Gulf Cooperation Council's top official reflects a broader regional pattern that has held throughout nearly every major escalation of this conflict. Gulf governments, whatever their individual diplomatic calculations regarding their own relationships with Iran, have consistently and publicly sided against Iran whenever attacks have directly targeted their own territory or hosted American forces. That consistency matters because it undercuts any narrative Iran might attempt to construct suggesting broad regional sympathy for its position. The countries most directly exposed to Iran's retaliatory capability have time and again chosen public condemnation over neutral silence, a pattern this latest round of strikes on Bahrain and Kuwait appears to have reinforced rather than reversed, even as those same countries continue absorbing the direct physical and economic risk of hosting the American military infrastructure Iran keeps threatening to target. Separately, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency issued formal guidance, advising commercial airlines against operating any flights within Iranian airspace, at any altitude or flight level, a precaution reflecting just how seriously European aviation regulators are treating the risk this specific escalation poses to civilian aircraft transiting the broader region. That kind of formal aviation safety advisory, issued by an official European regulatory body, rather than simply reported as informal industry caution, represents a significant, tangible marker of how seriously this latest round of hostilities is being treated by institutions with direct responsibility for civilian safety, entirely separate from the military and diplomatic dimensions of this conflict. Consider what an advisory of that kind actually requires before it gets issued. Aviation safety regulators don't advise airlines to avoid an entire national airspace at every altitude without first conducting a genuine risk assessment based on the observed pattern of missile and drone activity in that specific airspace. The fact that European regulators felt this latest round of hostilities warranted exactly that kind of blanket advisory, rather than a more narrowly targeted warning about specific routes or altitudes, suggests genuine concern that the volume and unpredictability of missile and drone traffic currently moving through Iranian airspace has crossed a threshold where no altitude or corridor can be confidently characterized as safe for civilian aircraft. That's a meaningful, independently verified signal about the current state of this conflict, coming from an institution with no political stake in either side's broader narrative. There's a specific, deeply troubling detail from this exact window that deserves direct attention because it represents a serious and explicit threat rather than the kind of generalized hostile rhetoric this conflict has produced regularly. A Telegram channel closely aligned with the IRGC published a photograph purporting to identify the specific hotel where the American president was staying during the NATO summit in Ankara, along with his floor number. Separately, a hardline member of Iran's parliament posted publicly on social media suggesting that, with the president currently in Turkey for the summit, Iran should openly target his location there with missiles. Statements like this, naming a sitting head of state's specific physical location and openly advocating a missile strike against it, cross well beyond the category of angry rhetoric this conflict has otherwise produced in abundance. Whether this specific threat reflects genuine operational intent or reflects the same pattern of inflammatory, largely symbolic hardline posturing this conflict has generated throughout, it represents exactly the kind of statement serious security services have to treat as credible until proven otherwise. And it's a meaningful data point in understanding just how far Iran's most extreme domestic political voices are currently willing to go in their public rhetoric. It's worth being precise about what elevates this specific incident above the general category of hostile Iranian rhetoric that has run throughout this entire war. Generalized calls for revenge, chants at funeral processions, and even prior documented assassination plots working through deniable criminal intermediaries all represent one category of threat, serious but generally indirect, and operating at some remove from any specific, identifiable target location. Publishing a photograph purporting to show a sitting foreign head of state's exact hotel and floor number, paired with an explicit public call from a sitting member of parliament to target that location with missiles, represents something categorically more direct. A specific geolocated target identification combined with an open call to strike it, made by figures with genuine institutional standing, rather than anonymous online accounts. That combination is precisely why security services in any country hosting a foreign head of state would treat this kind of statement with the utmost seriousness, regardless of how likely or unlikely an actual operational strike against a NATO member's territory during an active summit might seem on its face. Consider what this specific moment represents in the broader arc of this 3-week-old ceasefire, and why it deserves to be understood as a genuine turning point, rather than simply another entry in an already familiar cycle of provocation and response. According to reporting tracking this conflict closely, Wednesday's exchange marks the third separate occasion the United States has launched major strikes against Iran, while formal talks were still technically ongoing, a pattern Iranian officials have specifically cited as having eroded any remaining trust between the two sides. A ceasefire framework that has now absorbed 3 separate rounds of major strikes within its first 3 weeks of existence was never functioning as a genuine cessation of hostilities in any meaningful sense. It was functioning at best as a loose ceiling on the intensity of ongoing conflict, one that both sides have repeatedly tested and, in this most recent instance, appear to have broken through entirely. Look at the actual cadence of that pattern, because 3 major strikes in 3 weeks is a genuinely remarkable frequency for an arrangement that was supposed to represent a meaningful pause in hostilities. That works out to roughly 1 major flare-up per week since the memorandum was signed, each one following an almost identical script. A provocation, typically involving attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait, followed by an American retaliatory strike, followed by an Iranian counter-retaliation, followed by both sides publicly blaming the other for violating the ceasefire's terms. A pattern repeating with that kind of mechanical regularity suggests something more structural than simple bad luck or isolated miscalculation. It suggests a ceasefire whose underlying terms were never genuinely accepted by at least one significant faction on the Iranian side, one that has used every available opportunity to test how much continued pressure on shipping the arrangement could actually absorb before triggering a response severe enough to threaten the framework's survival entirely. There's also a symbolic dimension to the timing of all of this that shouldn't be overlooked. These strikes and this presidential declaration are unfolding during the exact week Iran is holding an extended funeral procession for its slain supreme leader, with his coffin having been carried through Najaf, Iraq, on its way toward eventual burial in Mashhad. A government simultaneously managing a multi-day, multi-city funeral explicitly built around themes of martyrdom and promised revenge, while also absorbing the largest single American military strike of the ceasefire period and launching an 85-target retaliatory operation of its own, is a government attempting to project both solemn national mourning and defiant military strength in the same narrow window of time. Whether Iran's actual command structure has the coherence to manage both of those competing imperatives simultaneously is itself an open question, one this exact sequence of events raises without fully answering. The tension between mourning and military defiance is worth sitting with a little longer because it illustrates something genuinely difficult about the position Iran's government currently occupies. A funeral of this scale and duration requires enormous logistical coordination, security planning, and public messaging discipline, all of which competes directly for the same limited bandwidth the government also needs to manage an active military exchange with the world's most powerful armed force. Running both of those operations simultaneously at genuine scale either reflects a level of institutional capacity that has survived the war's damage more intact than outside observers might assume, or it reflects a government stretching itself dangerously thin across two enormous simultaneous undertakings, with neither receiving the full attention and coordination it would otherwise demand under calmer circumstances. Now consider what comes next, because the pieces currently in motion suggest this conflict is likely to keep escalating rather than settling back into its previous uneasy equilibrium. With the oil sanctions waiver revoked, expect renewed American enforcement action against tankers attempting to move Iranian crude, a return to the kind of interdiction and redirection operations that characterized the blockade period earlier in this war. Reports have also indicated that a planned visit by the Secretary of Defense to Israel, originally intended in part to discuss regional security cooperation, has been affected by this latest round of escalation, itself a signal of how quickly this specific flare-up has reshaped the broader diplomatic and military calendar surrounding this conflict. That kind of ripple effect, a scheduled diplomatic visit disrupted by a fast-moving military escalation elsewhere in the same theater, illustrates just how interconnected every element of American strategy in this region has become. A defense secretary's planned meetings in Israel, presumably intended to address a range of bilateral security topics, cannot easily proceed on a normal schedule when the broader region he's traveling into is simultaneously absorbing one of the most significant escalations of an adjacent, ongoing war. That kind of disruption to routine diplomatic and military scheduling is itself a quiet but meaningful indicator of how seriously this specific moment is being treated inside the American national security apparatus, regardless of what gets said publicly at any podium. Weigh the two sides of this equation as it stands right now. On one side, an American military demonstrating it retains the capability to strike more than 80 targets in a single night, destroy more than 60 fast attack boats, and do so while explicitly declaring the underlying diplomatic framework no longer operative. On the other side, an Iranian government that, despite absorbing that level of damage, retained enough operational capacity to launch a genuinely large-scale retaliatory strike against American positions in two separate countries within hours, while simultaneously managing a national funeral, a wounded and unseen new supreme leader, and hardline factions within its own political system, openly calling for strikes against a sitting foreign head of state's physical location. Neither side, based on everything confirmed over these past 24 hours, currently appears to be operating from a position of full control over how this specific escalation resolves, and that shared absence of clear control is, in many ways, the most unsettling detail in this entire sequence of events. Consider, too, how this specific round of escalation fits into the much larger arc of this war, stretching back to its opening days in February. This conflict has already produced tens of thousands of casualties across military and civilian populations, multiple senior Iranian officials killed in targeted strikes, the death of Iran's own longtime supreme leader in the opening minutes of the war, and a succession crisis that has left his son and successor unseen in public for months. Against that backdrop, this latest exchange, however significant in its own right, represents another chapter in what has already become one of the most destructive and geopolitically consequential conflicts of the decade, rather than an isolated new crisis appearing out of nowhere. Understanding that broader context matters, because it clarifies that neither side entered this latest exchange from a position of naivety about how quickly and severely this specific conflict can escalate, once either party decides continued restraint is no longer worth the cost. That history also explains why both sides seem to move through these escalation cycles with such practiced speed. The choreography of this latest exchange, an attack on shipping, a large retaliatory strike, a counter-retaliation within hours, competing casualty claims, a market reaction, and public statements from officials on both sides characterizing the other as having broken the ceasefire, has now played out enough times that it almost reads like a rehearsed sequence rather than a spontaneous crisis. That familiarity cuts in two directions. It suggests both governments have developed enough experience managing this specific cycle that a full return to unrestrained, all-out war remains something both sides have, so far, managed to avoid triggering. But it also suggests a genuinely troubling normalization of this level of violence as simply the current baseline state of relations between these two countries. A baseline that keeps threatening to slip into something considerably worse every time a president declares, on the record, that the underlying framework holding it in check is now effectively dead. Watch whether Iran's promised continued retaliation, following what its own military explicitly described as only an initial response, translates into further strikes against American, Bahraini, or Kuwaiti targets in the hours ahead. Watch whether the reimposed oil sanctions and the renewed threat of tanker interdictions in the Strait produce the kind of sustained economic pressure capable of forcing a change in Iran's calculus, or whether Iran's leadership continues absorbing that pressure indefinitely rather than returning to genuine negotiation. Watch whether the specific threat against the president's location in Ankara receives any further attention from American or Turkish security services, given the specificity of the claims involved. And watch whether Iran's funeral proceedings, concluding within days with burial in Mashhad, produce any shift in tone from Iran's leadership once that particular source of domestic political pressure has run its course, or whether the underlying dynamics driving this entire cycle of escalation persist regardless of what happens once the coffin is finally laid to rest. There's a broader question worth holding on to as this situation continues developing in real time, because it's the question that will ultimately determine how this specific chapter of the war gets remembered. Every previous round of escalation throughout this ceasefire's brief, 3-week existence has eventually cooled, at least enough for both governments to characterize the underlying framework as still technically intact, however strained. This round carries a specific marker the previous ones didn't, an explicit public on-the-record presidential declaration that the memorandum is over, delivered not as a heat-of-the-moment aside, but as a direct, considered answer to a direct question. Whether that declaration ultimately proves to be a rhetorical marker of frustration that gets quietly walked back once this specific exchange cools, or whether it genuinely marks the point at which this particular diplomatic framework stopped functioning as a meaningful constraint on either side's behavior, is something only the coming days and weeks will actually reveal. Because that's where this conflict genuinely stands right now, hours into an exchange that has already reshaped how both governments are publicly describing the state of their relationship. A ceasefire, declared effectively dead by the president who helped negotiate it in the first place. A retaliatory strike that Iran itself described as merely an opening move, a specific, credible-sounding threat against a sitting head of state's physical location, posted openly on social media by a member of Iran's own parliament, and a region bracing, once again, for whatever comes next in a war that keeps demonstrating, month after month, just how far it still is from any genuine, lasting resolution.